Julian Lennon entered the world at a moment when history was already moving too fast for ordinary family life. Born in April 1963, just as Beatlemania began to sweep across continents, his arrival coincided with the transformation of his father from a young musician into a global phenomenon. John Lennon was no longer simply a husband or a father. He was becoming a symbol, a voice of rebellion, love, and cultural revolution. While fans screamed in stadiums and newspapers chronicled every movement of the Beatles, a quiet family life was slipping into the background. Julian's childhood began not in stability, but in secrecy. His parents were instructed to keep their marriage discreet. His existence had to be managed carefully. Fame did not create safety. It created distance. From the beginning, Julian grew up inside a world where attention was everywhere, yet personal presence was rare. His life was shaped by schedules, tour, and absences, long before he could understand what any of it meant. In those early years, John Lennon showed moments of genuine affection toward his son. Friends recalled him being emotional when he first met Julian, proud and visibly moved. Yet these moments were brief. Almost immediately, tour resumed. Studios replaced homes. Airports replaced dinner tables. The rhythm of John's life became dominated by deadlines and performances. Julian learned early that goodbyes were normal and reunions were uncertain. Cynthia Lennon carried the responsibility of raising their son largely on her own. While the world saw glamour and success, their household was defined by quiet routines and financial caution. Julian's memories were not filled with luxury. They were filled with waiting for visits, waiting for phone calls, waiting for promises to be fulfilled. Over time, waiting became part of his emotional language. It shaped how he understood relationships, expectations, and disappointment. As John Lennon's public image expanded, his private availability diminished. He became a spokesman for peace, creativity, and emotional openness. Interviews portrayed him as reflective and compassionate. His lyrics spoke of love and unity. Yet at home, consistency was missing. Julian experienced a father who could be warm one day and unreachable the next. After his parents divorced, the distance widened further. Visits became infrequent. Communication became sporadic. There was no stable rhythm of connection, no routine that a child could rely on. Julian later explained that what hurt most was not cruelty, but unpredictability. He never knew when his father would appear or disappear. This uncertainty created emotional insecurity that followed him into adulthood. He learned not to demand too much, because disappointment hurt less when expectations were low. Financially, Julian's upbringing also contradicted public perception. Many assumed he lived surrounded by privilege. In reality, Cynthia worked to support them. They lived modestly. There were no extravagant allowances, no effortless access to John's vast wealth. This disconnect between image and reality became another layer of emotional confusion. Julian was constantly reminded of his father's success through media, fans, and headlines, yet that success did not translate into daily support. It reinforced a feeling that his father belonged more to the world than to him. Fame, instead of bringing security, created separation. The brighter John Lennon's star became, the further away he seemed. One of the most meaningful gestures in Julian's childhood did not come from his father. It came from Paul McCartney. During John and Cynthia's divorce, Paul wrote a song for Julian to comfort him. That song would later become Hey Jude, one of the most famous recordings in history. For Julian, its origin mattered more than its fame. It was proof that someone had noticed his pain. Someone had taken time to care. That act of kindness left a deeper impression than any public tribute ever could. It demonstrated that presence does not require blood relation. It requires emotional availability. In many ways, Paul became a quiet emotional anchor during a turbulent period. When John Lennon was murdered in 1980, Julian was still young. Their relationship had never reached stability. His father's death did not end something complete. It ended something unfinished. Grief was complicated by unresolved questions. There were no final conversations, no chance to rebuild what had been broken. The loss carried not only sadness, but regret. Julian mourned not only the man who died, but the relationship that never fully existed. Death closed the door on every possibility of reconciliation. The aftermath brought another shock. John Lennon's estate was enormous. Yet Julian received very little direct inheritance. Most assets were placed under the control of Yoko Ono. Julian's share was limited to a trust fund shared with his younger half-brother. For Julian, this was not primarily about money. It was about recognition. It felt like confirmation that he had always been secondary. That realization deepened existing wounds. It suggested that even in planning for the future, his father had not fully considered him. Unable to resolve the matter privately, Julian was forced into legal action. He sued his father's widow to claim what he believed was rightfully his. The legal battle lasted more than 16 years. It was emotionally exhausting. Public scrutiny intensified. Media outlets framed it as greed, ignoring the emotional context. Julian endured years of courtrooms, negotiations, and delays. Throughout the process, he remained restrained. He rarely spoke publicly about his pain. But the struggle left permanent marks. When the case finally ended, Julian received a settlement. Yet even this victory was bittersweet. To reclaim personal items from his childhood, letters, instruments, photographs, he had to purchase them at auction. He once said he was buying his father's belongings with his father's money. That sentence summarized years of emotional confusion. It highlighted how legal resolution could not replace emotional closure. Ownership did not equal healing. As Julian built his own music career, he worked deliberately to avoid relying on his father's legacy. He released albums, toured internationally, and developed his own artistic identity. He refused to market himself simply as John Lennon's son. Yet the label followed him everywhere. Interviews always returned to the same topic. For decades, Julian answered politely. He protected his father's image. He avoided confrontation. But emotional restraint comes at a cost. By the time Julian Lennon entered his early 60s, something inside him had quietly shifted. For decades, he had carried his story carefully, editing his memories before sharing them, choosing words that would not offend fans or disturb the carefully protected image of his father. Every interview required emotional calculation. Every public statement required restraint. Over time, this self-censorship became exhausting. He realized that silence had never healed his wounds. It had only postponed them. Protecting his father's reputation had come at the cost of his own emotional truth. Julian began to understand that the myth surrounding John Lennon had become more important to the world than the real experiences of the people closest to him. And he had helped maintain that myth by remaining quiet. As he grew older, he questioned why he was still carrying that burden. Why should his life be shaped by someone else's narrative? This realization marked the beginning of a slow but powerful emotional awakening. In late 2024, that awakening was accelerated by a medical crisis that Julian never expected. While traveling for work and promoting his creative projects, he received a phone call that would change everything. Doctors informed him that tests had confirmed melanoma, one of the most dangerous forms of skin cancer. The news was sudden and terrifying. Within days, his entire schedule was canceled. Christmas plans disappeared. Projects were postponed. His only focus became survival. He flew back immediately and underwent surgery to remove cancerous tissue from his shoulder and arm. As he waited for results, he confronted the possibility of death for the first time in a deeply personal way. Facing mortality stripped life down to its essentials. Fame, money, and reputation suddenly felt meaningless. What mattered were relationships, unresolved emotions, and unspoken truths. The illness forced Julian to reflect on everything he had avoided confronting for years. During his recovery, Julian experienced a kind of emotional clarity he had never known before. Physical vulnerability opened doors to emotional honesty. He began revisiting memories he had long pushed aside. He remembered birthdays without phone calls, school events without parents in the audience, holidays spent wondering if his father would appear. These were not dramatic moments. They were quiet absences, and those absences accumulated over time, shaping his self-image. Julian realized that much of his life had been spent waiting for approval, waiting for affection, waiting for recognition. The waiting never fully ended. It simply became part of his personality. He learned to survive by lowering expectations, by telling himself that distance was normal. Now, in his 60s, he finally allowed himself to admit how deeply that pattern had hurt him. When Julian began speaking publicly about these experiences, many fans were unprepared for his honesty. One statement in particular drew global attention. He said that Paul McCartney had been more of a father figure to him than John Lennon. This was not said with anger. It was said with calm acceptance. Julian explained that Paul had shown consistency when John could not. He had checked in. He had offered comfort. He had been present. These small actions had made a lasting difference. For Julian, fatherhood was not about biology. It was about reliability. It was about showing up. His words challenged romanticized ideas about family and legacy. They reminded listeners that emotional support often comes from unexpected places. Julian also addressed his father's personal struggles with greater nuance than ever before. He acknowledged John Lennon's battles with addiction, insecurity, and childhood trauma. He understood that fame had intensified these problems. He recognized that his father was not emotionally equipped for consistent parenting. But Julian also made something clear. Understanding hardship does not erase responsibility. Pain does not justify neglect. Genius does not excuse absence. For years, fans had framed John's flaws as the inevitable price of greatness. Julian rejected that narrative. He presented a more realistic one. His father was human. He was talented. He was flawed. And his choices had consequences. With this new perspective, Julian reevaluated the inheritance battle that had defined much of his adult life. He realized that his legal fight had never been about wealth. It had been about validation. Subconsciously, he had hoped that the estate would prove that his father had thought of him, that he had planned for his future, that he had cared enough to protect him financially and emotionally. When that did not happen, it felt like a second rejection. The court case became a public symbol of private pain. Winning money did not heal that wound. It only confirmed what he had suspected since childhood. He had often been an afterthought. While Julian was processing these realizations, his younger half-brother Sean was navigating his own relationship with their father's legacy. Sean had lost John at a very young age. His memories were incomplete. They were preserved through recordings, photographs, and stories. As an adult, Sean chose to protect and manage that legacy. He supervised re-releases. He curated archives. He became a guardian of history. For him, preservation was a way of staying connected. Julian respected that path, even though he chose a different one. Where Sean focused on maintaining the myth, Julian focused on telling the truth. Despite their different experiences, the brothers developed a strong and respectful relationship. Media outlets often tried to create rivalry between them. They expected jealousy, resentment, or competition. Instead, Julian and Sean chose cooperation. They supported each other's projects. They appeared together at events. They communicated openly. Their bond became a quiet rejection of the narrative imposed on them. It showed that shared loss does not have to produce division. It can also produce empathy. Both brothers understood that they had suffered in different ways, and neither blamed the other for it. As Julian reflected on his life, he arrived at a simple but powerful conclusion. Legacy is not built through fame alone. It is built through relationships. Albums fade, headlines disappear, statues lose meaning. What remains are memories of how people made us feel. Julian realized that his father's greatest failure had not been artistic. It had been emotional. He had changed the world through music, but he had struggled to nurture the people closest to him. Julian did not deny his father's greatness. He redefined it. True greatness, he argued, includes responsibility, presence, and care. In the end, Julian Lennon did not seek revenge, sympathy, or controversy. He sought understanding. He wanted his story to be heard without distortion, without sensationalism, without mythologizing. By speaking honestly, he gave voice to countless children who grew up in the shadow of powerful parents. His journey shows that emotional neglect can exist even in extraordinary circumstances. That wealth cannot replace love. That fame cannot guarantee connection. Julian chose truth over silence, healing over denial, and authenticity over applause. His story is not about blaming the past. It is about reclaiming the present.